Welcome to Putting Rare Diseases Patients First, Webinar 12. The ABCs of clinical trials for the CDG and NGLY1 community. This webinar is being conducted with CDG Care. I'm Lorna Speed, and I'm the founder of Putting Rare Diseases Patients First. I will be the co-chair for this webinar. You'll be hearing from Andrea a little bit later. I would like to extend a very warm welcome for everyone on the platform. I see we have quite a number of people joining right now, just before we start, as expected. But we also have some very important people watching us on YouTube Live. We were oversubscribed and we had to close registration. And so a lot of people have been advised to watch us on YouTube Live. So we welcome you very warmly. Before we commence the presentations, I will give some instructions for this webinar. We are recording, and so we need you to keep all noise making to a minimum. Therefore, please mute yourselves on Zoom and silence all noise-making devices in the background, just in case you come unmuted. We are delighted to be able to collaborate with CDG Care to present the ABCs of clinical trials for the CDG and NGLY1 communities. I am going to say a little bit about Putting Rare Diseases Patients First, our organization, and about myself. And then Andrea will talk about CDG Care and her background as well. Putting Rare Diseases Patients First was started in 2014, and we're a nonprofit. We're a registered charity in California. We exist to provide information about the new medicine development process, clinical trials, finding a diagnosis, all the sorts of areas that patients with rare diseases struggle with. We are there with expertise to provide information that is actionable. And the idea of actionable information means it's not academic information. It's not information for information's sake. It is information that you can do something with, and we will emphasize that throughout this webinar. Why did I start this organization? I'm a clinical pharmacist from the United Kingdom. I did a PhD that got me into the industry. So I started out in hospital pharmacy. And with this PhD, I was able to get a very solid understanding of the new medicine development process, particularly in relation to regulatory processes and safety assessment. I joined large pharma and then also joined small biotech. So I've worked in both extremes, the very large companies at headquarters, group company level, working on regulatory strategies and new medicine development programs for many different treatments, oncology right through to respiratory, rare diseases was something I really enjoyed working on. Paget's disease was the first rare disease I worked on. I have a special practice, therefore, in rare diseases, and I am a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, and my consulting firm was started in 2004. I wrote a book on clinical trials for patients and healthy volunteers to help them to navigate their way through the process. That book was written because I saw a need in terms of translating, using my expertise to translate information, complicated new medicine information about the clinical trial process, about the new medicine development process, about safety aspects into content in the informed consent process that patients could understand. And that was very challenging, and I felt there was not enough time in the informed consent process for them to understand everything. And that's why I wrote the book, and Oxford University Press published it. So that's my background. And now I am really pleased to be able to ask Andrea to tell us a little bit about CDG Care. Andrea approached me a few months ago and asked if we could host this event. And we've been working very hard together and very well together since then. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Andrea, and she will tell us about her background as well on the next slide.
Hi, everyone. Welcome all of our patients, our professionals, our industry partners who have joined us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Speed. It's been a pleasure to get to know putting rare diseases patients first and the wonderful mission that you all provide through these very educational webinars. CDG Care was actually formed also in 2014 and is a 501c3 organization that was founded by parents. It is volunteer run out of Colorado, but we are licensed to operate in all 50 states. We have a multi-pronged mission, which is really focused on awareness and education, as well as resources and research. So a few of the initiatives that our board of directors focuses on when we meet and look forward to the coming year, we always have May 16th is our Awareness Day campaign, which is actually ongoing right now. We write to all of the 50 states to be able to get the governors to declare that CDG Awareness Day will be recognized. We also, just a little excitement, we have the state capitol in Maryland is going to light up green on May 16th, first time for that. We provide educational videos and a quarterly newsletter that you can subscribe to on our homepage. We have webinars. This is the first in what will be a series of 3 for 2021. And then we also have the Biennial Family Conference, which we hope to be sharing more information about as well. We also recently launched the Family Support Network. If you haven't had the opportunity to join, it's on our homepage. We provide 2 different patient financial assistance grant programs for all families diagnosed with CDG or NGLY1, and those are global as well. We also have the Global Patient Registry, CDG Connect, our members of the Frontiers in CDG Consortium, and then we are just about to announce what our annual CDG Research Awards are for 2021 and what we have on the horizon as we move forward. Myself, my daughter was actually diagnosed with PMM2 CDG in 2011. We had, everyone has a very unique story to diagnosis. Ours was that we didn't know she had a rare disease until she was about 12 months old because she was born prematurely. And so a lot of her delays and feeding issues were attributed to that, which could be considered what many families are familiar with, a misdiagnosis along the way. I personally, prior to her being born, I went to school to have a master's in health administration, as well as a Juris Doctorate. And I was an attorney working in actually the social service industry in Southern Illinois before I became a rare disease advocate in 2011. In 2014, after meeting a lot of families not through Facebook, back then we had email listservs, I worked with what was a prior nonprofit for the field of CDG to develop CDG Care. And so we formed in 2014, and the rest is history. We continue to grow with new CDG types every year, new families every week. And it's truly a pleasure to be here to present this symposium to all of you today with our fantastic speakers and volunteers. Next slide. I want to thank also our financial sponsor for our 2021 webinar series, Travere Therapeutics. This program would not be possible without their support. And I want to always add our disclaimer that today's program was in no way influenced in the development or creation by any of our industry partners. It was solely upon the basis of our speakers and the needs that our community had identified. Thank you all. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Travere Therapeutics. I know you're wondering who else is on this program. And so I thought I would take a few minutes just to go through the audience. We had 87 people registered. We've had a lot of people just come on almost immediately. And I just want to emphasize the fact that with CDG and NGLY1, a lot of the people that show an interest are going to be the parents. Obviously, there are a few patients who are interested as well, but it's going to be the parents. So they're advocates, but they're not really professional advocates in terms of how we would categorize that. And this shows, again, are you a professional advocate or professional? And so we had quite a number of physicians and nurses and even students registering, and obviously people working in the new medicine development field. We've got quite a number of people working in biotech, but because our goal is directly to the patients and the parents, I was very pleased to see that we have almost 60% of our audience are parents. And when we asked about the geographical reach, because we wanted to tap into this and see that we are reaching patients and parents all around the globe, because with an ultra rare disease, we need to make sure we're tapping into as many different networks as possible. So we added in the geographical question after we'd started registering people. And so although we have most people from the US, I'm pleased to see that we do have some even from Southern America. And I think we got someone all the way from Taiwan and Australia. And so we want to spread the word. So please help us to spread the word. They will be able to watch from anywhere in the world on YouTube Live in the coming weeks. So it's really good to see that, yes, we've got a lot of people in our home base, but also from Europe and other countries. Even Africa, we had some people from Africa. If you're on today from Africa or India, because I think we had one or two from India as well, welcome. This is our disclaimer, and we have to give this because we definitely want to help patients, but we have to be careful that we don't try to take the place of your physicians and those who are overseeing your day-to-day care. So we are giving you information and advice which is not specific to your medical situation. We will give you the opportunity to ask questions, and if your question is too specific, we will rephrase it so that it can be of use to others. And bear in mind that we're recording, so when you do have the opportunity to ask questions, just give a first name. Don't give any identifying information or personal information because it will be on the recording. As I said, our goal as an organization at Putting Rare Diseases Patients First is to provide actionable information for patients and the parents. And that applies to CDG and NGLY1 as well. We know we have a number of professionals in the audience, and we hope that you will gain a lot from hearing about how we develop the content for patients and parents. We will give the opportunity for questions near the end, but I just want to emphasize this is for patients and parents, because the types of questions they will ask are a little bit different to those who are academically studying or even treating patients. And so this is their opportunity. I know you will understand. This is the outline of our presentations. We were able to work with the speakers and we developed recordings. So we developed the recordings a few days ago. And we have recordings for the first three presentations here, and then Dr. Edmondson will give his presentation in real time. They are all, I believe, on the platform still, but they do have to see patients. And so they may be going and coming, but they'll be back for Q&A if they have to leave. So I'm going to start out by laying a foundation. And this foundation is around about why clinical trials, why are they important, how can you get involved, how does the new medicine development process work? And then Dr. Lam is going to talk about natural history studies. So I touch on natural history studies, and then Dr. Lam is going to drill even deeper into natural history studies. You'll be hearing about studies that are ongoing that you can get involved with. And then Dr. Morava is going to interview a patient. So we have the recording of that. And just to set the scene, she's going to talk about clinical trials and why you and your voice matter in this whole process. we had quite a number of questions. You were able to ask questions if you wanted to. And one of the questions, of course, is how far are we away from a cure? How far are we away from a treatment? And Dr. Edmondson is going to address that. So we will have final questions, hopefully for about 30 minutes or so, but then we will go into a patient-parent room with the patients and parents. You don't need to do anything, just stay on the platform at the end, and you will be put into the patient-parent room again. And we will give you the opportunity to ask any remaining questions. So we do obviously have some questions. You'll be able to ask questions in real time as well in front of the whole platform. But we want to let you know that there's even additional time, because that's the whole reason that we're here today, is to make sure your questions are addressed, your concerns are heard. And so that's how we're going to handle this today. So I will be between each of the presentations. There are a few steps I have to do on the Zoom platform. So I know you will bear with me while I bring up these presentations and make sure that we're optimizing for the sound and the video. So there's a few moments in between those areas. So we're going to our first presentation, which is laying a foundation. So just give me a moment here. For those of us who went to Sunday school or Sabbath school, we heard about the man who was wise, and he built his house upon a very solid foundation. We also heard about the other person, the man who was foolish, and he built his house on sand. When we have a solid foundation in terms of our understanding about our conditions, our clinical trial processes, we will be able to move forward in a very strong way, in a very appropriate way. And that's why I want to lay a foundation. So I'm going to talk about new medicine development, novel new medicine development, but I'll also touch on repurposing of medicines that have been around for a while, and why that is so important, especially for rare diseases. And then look at what you can do after my presentation. So you should be thinking about every single presentation you hear, what steps do I need to take now? Novel new medicines, when I think about novel medicines, when I speak about novel medicines, I'm speaking about these types of new medicines: small molecules, large molecules, gene therapies, gene editing, cellular therapies, antisense. If you don't know the meanings of these terms, don't worry about it too much. Just know that they're medicines that have gone through research, animal studies, toxicology studies, so that we could see how safe they are, and then into clinical trials. They went through a regulatory review, and then they were given an approval, and these are the novel medicines. When they're in the investigational stage, i.e. we're doing the research, they're called investigational new medicines. Repurposed medicines are medicines that have been around for a while. We know a lot about them because they've been used for a very long time. Often they are off patent. So these are usually small molecules, and they would be generic medicines by the time we're looking at repurposing them. So let's think about novel new medicines and what that means. The first thing anyone will tell you about a novel new medicine program is it's very complex. It doesn't matter whether it's a rare disease or a disease that's been around for a long time. Every disease has its challenges. We'll go through research. We'll carry out studies in animals to see what might happen in the human situation. And as anyone doing drug development will tell you, we can do a lot in animals. We can prove we can treat and cure any disease in animals. It becomes more difficult once you move into the human stage. So this drug development process consists of doing everything we can to get into the clinical trials. If the trials work out well and we prove that the drug is safe and effective in the disease that we were studying, we'll apply for approvals and then we can market. And we're usually doing this in many countries, not just in the US or not just in Europe. First thing I want to emphasize is this process is very expensive. We're talking about $2.8 billion for a truly new medicine, including the cost of failures. And Tufts University have studied this, they've researched this, and they have been able to prove the cost of a truly new medicine development program, including the cost of getting it wrong sometimes, because there is a very high failure rate. And medicines fail in the investigational stage for various reasons. Sometimes safety, sometimes because they were not as effective as we thought they might be. Sometimes because we don't know everything there is to know about the disease or even about the new drug. And sometimes there may be business reasons why new medicines fail. So why are clinical trials so important? And I want to emphasize here that of the $2.8 billion spent on development, 60% is spent in the clinical phase. So it is very important. But it is also important that we get it right, that if we go into a clinical trial, we have a good assurance that we're going to get the results we need. But the clinical trial is the best that we have for determining if a drug is safe and effective. There's no other way of doing it. If we were to rely on animal studies and then go into human beings, selling the drug to humans to use in humans in different diseases, we would find that there are going to be disconnects because there are animal types of disease that don't necessarily occur in the human situation. And so also there's an issue of numbers. How many numbers of animals and what types of animal models would you need to study to get results that would be predictive? And this is where you come in, because we need patients to engage with this process. And engagement is telling us about how you experience your condition or how your child experiences the rare condition, but also engaging in patient registries, making sure your name, where you are, what sort of diagnosis you've received. When did you receive your diagnosis? How many other clinical trials, if any, have you been involved with? We need you to be in these patient registries. And then we need you to engage with natural history studies. These are non-interventional, so you will not be receiving medicines or investigational drugs because you're in a natural history study. You may be taking them anyway because of what's being prescribed, but the natural history study allows us to see how your condition or how your child's condition is progressing with time. And that's incredibly important so that we can know what's appropriate for study. So engaging tells us what's happening with you, because if you were to rely on others engaging, how they experience their condition and disease, rare or not, may be different to the way you're experiencing your rare condition. And out of that process of engagement, we're able to define the endpoints, i.e., how do we study the condition? How do we study the disease? What types of patients do we need to put into the study? How long do we need to study them for? And statistical concepts. How do we compare them with others? You will need to give your informed consent, so there's no need to worry that you might find yourself in a study you didn't know you were involved in. You will need to give informed consent to go into a clinical trial. And I want to emphasize, this is not a contract. You're not signing a contract. You're not signing your life away. You are giving your consent to what is known at that point to be administered the investigational drug and to enter the study, or for your child to enter the study. But if the information changes, if more adverse reactions come to light and you decide, I don't want to stay in this study, then you can take yourself out of the study or your child. So there's that level of assurance. And by good clinical practice, it must not interfere with your treatment. So that is one of the things that you can be assured of. If you leave a study you should still be treated with whatever is available at that time. This is a two-way process, so it's a process. So you should ask questions, you'll be given information, you must write down what you don't understand and try to get clarity and ask questions. With rare diseases, there are a number of challenges. The biggest challenge probably is that we don't have other treatments to compare with. So we're really stumbling around sometimes in the dark trying to work out what we need to do for that rare disease or condition. But the other issue is numbers of patients. And if many companies become interested in CDG and GLY1, you'll find that there is competition for the patients that are interested in being in the studies. So competition for patients, making sure that we use our patient resources in the best way that we can, incredibly important. So if we look at the top of this schematic, we are studying the disease itself, getting an understanding of how the disease changes with time. We're finding the dose in phase 1. We're confirming the dose in phase 2. And we're looking at how we can treat the patients at the appropriate dose in a similar way, the same medicine that would be used when the drug is on the market if everything goes well during phase 3. So the phase 3 part of the program is extremely important. And we're wanting to make sure that risk and benefit match or balance. We don't want too much risk represented by the cross. We want more benefit than there is risk. And that varies by the patients, as we saw with the COVID-19, when some side effects and adverse reactions began to come to light with some of the vaccines. When we begin to look at who is most likely to benefit and what is the risk benefit, then we begin, the regulatory authorities, also the companies and the patients, because you're a very important part of this, begin to think about what is the risk benefit profile for my situation. And children in clinical trials, there are ethical challenges because a very small child, cannot give their consent to take part in a clinical trial. So that's going to be up to the parent or guardian. But as a child becomes a little bit older and understands what's going on in terms of their condition and their clinical trials that are available, they can be asked if they want to be in a clinical trial. You see this child here is very lively, happy. If they're in a clinical trial and they suddenly become morose and sad and depressed, and the drug has already been administered in the clinical trial, that may be a sign that the child is experiencing an adverse event. And so that should be reported to those conducting the clinical trial as an adverse event. Because if you see a change in your child after they've gone into the clinical trial, the child cannot usually articulate that to you. And that should be information that's presented to those carrying out the study. Randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies are studies that are carried out in this way to reduce bias. There are certain situations where we don't need to necessarily double-blind or even include a placebo. Often those are life-threatening situations. We're wanting to make sure we randomize even in those situations so we can't influence which group patients go into. Double-blind means the doctor doesn't know, the physician doesn't know, the investigator doesn't know who's receiving which treatment. And I can talk a little bit more about this if you have questions on why we design studies in this way. But just bear in mind, because patient resources are so limited, we want to make sure any studies patients go into are appropriate so that we'll get results out of them that we can use. And at the end of the study, we will compare the results and see, do we get a better response with the drug, or are we getting a better response with the placebo, in which case the study is a failure and the drug likely is not working. With repurposed medicines, we are actually looking at medicines that have gone all the way through to approval, research, development, and now they've been on the market for a while. And often, as I said, they're off patent. And so these medicines can now be evaluated for whether we can repurpose them and use the same medicines that were already developed. So maybe a tablet or capsule or even injection, and use them for this new indication. That means you you basically bypass a lot of this early work, but you still have to find the appropriate dose. You have to demonstrate the dose and maybe even try to get a patent for use in that new indication and develop a new way of administering it. So there are some challenges with this repurposing approach, often because investors would not see a benefit for them. But it is a very quick way to see if a drug is able to work, or a way of administering the drug, or the type of pharmacological action is appropriate for the condition. So what do you do now after you've heard all this? Because there's a lot of information I've presented. Obviously, most important thing, lowest hanging fruit here, is enroll in the patient registry, at least one, and enroll in natural history studies. Find out about your condition and the clinical trials that are ongoing or will be starting soon, and you'll be hearing about that today. So you've really earned the applause for coming today and being a part of this webinar. You'll find out about clinical trials, novel as well as repurposed, on clinicaltrials.gov. I know some of you asked a question about being in different countries, and they may not be clinical trials, may not even have physicians with the expertise that there are in the US. And we'll talk about that during Q&A. Think about your due diligence when you see a clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov, or you're contacted to take part in a clinical trial. Be aware of conflicts of interest. With conflicts of interest, we're talking usually about financial conflicts of interest. With the financial conflict of interest, anyone who has a financial interest in the outcome of the study should not be overseeing the patients. And so this is really important that you look into that. It doesn't matter who's conducting the study or what rare disease you have. This is an important aspect to this. Due diligence. And then the study design, looking at the study design, making sure the design is appropriate. If it's an open label study, there's no double blind, there's no randomization. Really begin to question if this is the best use of your time and the resources in the patient groups that you may be leading. And think about the duration of the study and the time commitment and probability of success to get a good outcome. We want you to take your place at the table. We're so pleased that you're here today, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're taking your place at the table. You're helping us to ensure that we understand the maximum we can about your condition. And as we find out more about your condition, as you take part in natural history studies and patient registries and clinical trials, we can educate the regulatory authorities so they understand what is appropriate for them to request in the guidelines and requirements and regulations. There's some noise. Please mute yourself. And Chantal, please. Thank you. But I hope that was useful for you. And I laid the foundation, and now we're going to look at the rest of the building. And I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Lam, and Andrea is going to introduce Dr. Christina Lam, and then we'll bring up Dr. Lam's recording. So Andrea, over to you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina Lam, who is very well known to our CDG community. She's an attending physician at Seattle Children's Hospital and assistant professor at the Department of Pediatrics at University of Washington School of Medicine. She joined Seattle Children's after completing her pediatric and genetics residency at UCLA and her biomedical genetics fellowship at the NIH. Many of you may have met her a while back at the NIH as well. Dr. Lam provides inpatient and outpatient clinical services, and her research focuses on clinical aspects of inborn errors of metabolism, especially CDGs and NGLY1. She's also a committed member of the CDG Care Medical Advisory Board. And with that, we will listen to a very wonderful talk on natural history studies.
Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on the ABCs of natural history and clinical trials. I'm going to be talking about natural history studies in CDG and NGLI1. To do this, I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to try to answer what are natural history studies. Then I will go into the landscape of what natural history studies actually did and do exist in this group of disorders, and then actually dive more deeply into the specific examples of the natural history studies that are ongoing, and finally address some frequently asked questions that have come through. So to begin, what is a natural history study? Natural history study is a study that follows a group of people over time who have or are at risk of developing a specific disease. And in our case, it's a group of people who do have the condition. And in this study, it collects health information in order to understand how the medical condition or disease develops and progresses over time. So looking at the landscape of natural history studies in the past and present within CDG and NGLI1, this is the list that I was able to come up with. It may not be comprehensive, but these are the ones that I know about. So starting in 2014, the intramural NIH program started a natural history study that studied all individuals with CDGs, any type, as well as NGLI1 deficiency. And its official name was Clinical and Basic Investigations into Known and Suspected Congenital Disorders of Glycosylation. Moving forward in time, in 2017, Glycomine, a company interested in developing a specific therapeutic for PMM2 CDG, began their natural history study in PMM2 CDG. Following this, Grace Science Foundation funded a study based at Stanford University into NGLI1 deficiency, and its title is NGLI1 Deficiency, a Prospective Natural History Study. Then we began our natural history with the Foundations in CDG Consortium, which is funded by the NIH, and it also studies all types of congenital disorders of glycosylation as well as NGLI1 deficiency. And its title is Clinical and Basic Investigations into Congenital Disorders of Glycosylation. And finally, Cure SRD5A3 has sponsored a single year natural history study into this particular condition. So diving in more deeply, I'm going to talk about each specific natural history study, how it was designed and how it's done, and why we're doing it, as well as give an example of a result, or what we actually get out of doing a natural history study. So starting with the Frontiers in CDG natural history study. This study was, as we discussed earlier, started in 2019, and this natural history takes place in one of 9 clinical sites throughout the United States. The particular sites are marked on the map by a blue marker, and they're specifically listed here on the left. The goal of this particular natural history study, which in scientific terms is called a specific aim, is to figure out what the health problems, laboratory abnormalities, and symptoms that individuals with CDG and NGLI1 deficiency experience over time at different ages. And the second goal is to validate CDG rating scale a patient-reported outcome, as well as quality of life measures for CDG. And why are we looking at all this data? It's really to better understand the disease so that we can determine what potential therapies and needs are out there for this group of patients, as well as to provide the groundwork or foundation needed for future clinical trials to be successful. And I will dive into this by talking about the examples as to how this is actually going to be helpful. So in terms of how we're doing it, again, anyone with any type of CDG or NGLY1 deficiency is eligible to participate. And when they do participate, we gather baseline and annual, so yearly, follow-up visit information. And the information that we're actually gathering is put into a database in a secure way that can be analyzed and shared with researchers that look into the disease. What information are we collecting? Again, most of the information is just routine clinical care visit information. So visits to doctors with an interview and a history that we gather the medical history in, as well as physical exam. We gather all the lab tests that are done from blood and urine, any type of studies such as EKGs or imaging like X-rays or MRIs, as well as food diary to understand how individuals are eating and what kind of special diet they need, for example. In addition to the regular clinical information that you get taken just for regular clinical care, so regular health maintenance care, there are two additional pieces in this study. One is goal attainment scaling scoring, in which we ask individuals for their 3 wishes. What 3 goals do they like to, longer term goals, are they hoping to achieve over time? And then every year we want to ask how close, or are you closer or further away from getting to this goal? And then we also ask the participants and their families to answer a multitude of quality of life questionnaires to help us understand what exactly is bothering them the most and what they would gain from a solution the most. What is the biggest bang of your buck if you're able to solve what problem? This is just an example of a quality of life questionnaire. Ask general questions about, in general, would you say your child's quality of life is excellent to poor? And how often does your child have fun with friends? And how often they get tired, for example. In terms of what we actually get out of doing these studies, I want to give a very concrete example. From doing this particular study, we were able to find out this result that's displayed here. So just to kind of walk you through this, ALT is a marker of liver injury. And on the left side, these are the levels. High is not good, it's abnormal. And below this blue line is normal. And in this axis, you can see individuals get as they get older. So as you can tell here, by doing our natural history study, we're able to formally collect and document that the marker of liver injury comes down by itself without any specific treatment over time. And similarly for other CDGs that are not PMN2, we don't have as many patients, so our data isn't as good and robust, but you can see a similar trend. So by doing this natural history study, we're able to collect this information, document it, publish it in the literature. And then with this piece of information, we're able to let drug companies, developers, for example, understand that this is not really something they want to target for developing a novel therapy, because natural history, it just gets better over time. So if you were trying to develop a drug that improves the ALT or liver function, you may not actually be spending your money in a wise way. And also, even if a drug were to be developed that improved this over time, it would be very hard to determine the drug was actually doing anything, because by natural history, it improves over time. So this is a very important piece of information that we're able to derive from doing this particular natural history study. Moving on, glycomine PMM2 natural history study. Similar to the first natural history study I talked about, This study also takes place in multiple centers, actually throughout Europe and the United States. Different from the previous study is that this study is sponsored by Glycomine, which is a specific company that is interested in developing a specific therapy for this specific disorder. Its objectives thus are slightly different. Similar to the first, it is to collect longitudinal, so data over time, clinical and biological information in patients with PMM2. But in addition, a very important piece of information they're trying to gather is to determine parameters to be used at the endpoints in the clinical trial for their particular therapeutic. Similar, it's over time, so up to 4 years at this point, and you have visits every 6 months. And at this point, they've been quite successful to recruit over 100 patients in our 11 sites. An example that they or we were able to find, I guess, in this natural history study that was very helpful to them is that antithrombin 3, which is a marker when it's low that makes you at risk for having abnormal blood clots. Antithrombin 3 is dysregulated in 80% of PMM2 patients, both in adults and pediatrics. So similar graph here. This is age of the patient, and this is the activity level. And normal range is between these two lines. Green is for pediatric normal range, and the blue is for adult normal range. As you can see, over time, as patients age, or as they are older, the number of patients that have abnormal activity stays stable. So this, in their mind, is a good marker that could be improved if a drug is working. And so this, they have decided, will be part of their endpoint for their therapeutic trial when that comes about. Not the entire endpoint, but part of it. And then moving on to NGLY1 natural history study. This particular natural history study has a special component in which there are actually remote visits and remote participants, but it is actually based only in one center at Stanford here. Similar to the other studies, you have annual visits and then even more frequent video visits. And then if you're only remote, you only have visits that are video visits. And in this study, for example, because they were able to take advantage of technology, they were able to enroll this participant all the way from South America. Again, very similar to the other natural history studies, they collect information from health assessments. So again, medical history, developmental history, neurologic history, examinations, and then they also are focused very much on different evaluations for their neurologic status. For remote visits, the group of assessments are more limited just because of what is able to be done remotely. And this study is funded by the Grace Science Foundation, which is a foundation that is focused on NGLY1 deficiency and is headed by Stanford. And then moving on to the last example for SRD5A3. This study is a shorter study, and it is run out of Dallas with, again, a family foundation that is focused on SRD5A3. And the purpose is very similar, again, to understand natural history of SRD5A3 and try to correlate some genetic information with clinical presentation and develop a scale to score disease severity. And in terms of what they were able to accomplish, they have enrolled 8 patients that all have the same genetic change, actually. And this is done completely remotely with review of medical records, online medical surveys and history, as well as a video and phone interview. And at this point, they're planning to publish their finding this year. And what they were able to determine, because because of the shorter duration is just the percentage of individuals with this particular condition in their cohort that have particular issues or clinical findings. So moving on to frequently asked questions, we did put out a poll before this webinar, and there are many questions, but I'd like to focus on these two questions because they directly relate to natural history studies. So the first is, how do I find out about natural history studies and clinical trials available, and where can I join such a clinical trial or natural history study? And the second is about that there are many different natural history studies, and you hear about all the ones I talked about. Are they different? Are they working together? And can I join them all or just one? So for the first question, as Dr. Speed mentioned earlier briefly, I'd like to introduce you to this website, www.clinicaltrials.gov. If you just type this into any web browser, can be Google, can be Chrome, can be anything, basically, you will come up to a web page that looks just like this. This is what comes up. And then, as you can see, there's some text boxes you can fill in. And one of them I would suggest putting in to figure out or find natural history or even clinical trials relating to your condition is to actually put in the name of the condition that you're interested in looking at. So in our cohort, typical pieces of words that you could put in here would be CDG or NGLI1 or congenital disorders of glycosylation or maybe PMM2. And when you type this in, I'm just typing in CDG and push enter, you then get brought to a second web page that lists the different studies found for CDG. And of course, you can do different searches to see if you have some overlap or new studies with different searches. And when you see this, you can see the title, the official title of the study, what the conditions are briefly, and then if they're interventions. If it's an intervention study, then that means it's not a natural history study, it's a clinical trial. If there's no intervention, this part is blank, then it's more likely to be a natural history study. So since we're talking about natural history studies, and this one is still recruiting, I decided to click on this, and this is Clinical and Basic Investigations into CDG, which is actually the Frontiers of Congenital Disorders of Glycosylation study. And when you click on this, it brings you to another web page, the top of which gives you a quick study description, and then design, which says it's observational and up to 150 participants at this point, and case only, and when it started, when we're hoping to have its first completion, but then maybe extended later. And then as you scroll down on this page, you find other very important information. You first run into this piece called eligibility, and this is where you can find out if your patient, your child, or the individual that you're interested in is eligible for the study. And you just look, are they, okay, yes, you can be an adult child or older. All genders and sexes are eligible, no healthy volunteers. And then you also look at the specific inclusion criteria, which says, okay, you can participate if you have a CDG based on genetic confirmation, and you cannot if you don't have a CDG. So pretty simple here. Scrolling down further, the other piece of information on this website that's important is the contacts and location. So if you've determined that this is something that your child, yourself, or the person of interest can participate in, you'd want to find out where the study is taking place. And then you can actually contact the people that are involved in the study directly with their phone number or email address. And this is probably the best place to find out accurate information about each of these studies. So moving on to the second question, the question about multiple natural history studies. Can you pick and choose? Do you need to pick and choose? Are we collaborating? So at this point in natural history studies, you can participate in one study, but it does not preclude you from participating in other studies. So basically it's a la carte. You can pick and choose which study you'd like to participate in, or you can participate in all of them or none of them, which is not what I'm hoping for. And then in terms of are we working together, in terms of the studies that we discuss and the ones that I'm aware of, we are trying our best to work together. For medical information, so all the information from history, physical, laboratory work, in general, if you have it drawn in one natural history study or part of your medical care, this information, the same information can be used in all the natural history studies. NIH, the one intramural, may want to redraw some because that ensures that the actual lab is done in a very, very standard way, but sometimes they will accept it as well. So any clinical information, most likely you don't have to redo. You just have to sign that consent if you're willing to participate, and we just do on our back end collect that information. So that's less, but then sometimes there are additional things such as the goal attainment score, the patient outcomes survey, patient and other special things that do need to be recollected. And in terms of information sharing, not all natural studies, history studies do share information, but we are trying our best, especially amongst the SRD 5A3 and GLI1. We're trying to share this information so that it'll be available, as well as the NIH, the 2 NIH-sponsored natural history studies. And so thank you very much for attending this talk, and we will address questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Lam. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure we all learned a lot. And again, write your questions down. We look forward to answering them near the end. Dr. Eva Morava is here today to present, and we're really pleased that she has taken the time, and just working with these experts has been amazing. So I would like Andrea again, if you could introduce Dr. Eva Morava, and I will bring up her recording.
Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eva Morava, the Professor of Medical Genetics at the Mayo Clinic and the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Inherited Metabolic Disease. Dr. Morava completed her specialty training in Europe and also in the US. She's a pediatrician, geneticist, and metabolic specialist at Mayo. She is actively involved in developing novel therapies and genetic disorders, and she is the PI of the multi-center study on natural history that Dr. Lam spoke about, the Frontiers in CDG Consortium. Dr. Morava has also volunteered and served as a committed member of CDG Care's Medical Advisory Board for the past 4 years. So it's my pleasure to hear her session speak. Thank you.
I do remember there is an interview with Holly, the parent of a child with a rare disease, and Dr. Morava is going to conduct that interview. I will go straight into that immediately afterwards. So there might not be a transition there. Bye.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about clinical trials. Some more today. You probably are exhausted already, so I'll try to be very brief. We talked about clinical trials, and I just want to remind you again that a clinical trial, that's an intervention, which could be a drug, it could be a medical device or a procedure, but actually the study is in people. So when we are doing a trial, it's not yet an accepted therapy and not part of the standard clinical care for either CDGs or NGLI1. So they really must follow a very strict protocol. Part of the enrollment process is consenting, which is an agreement between patient and the research team to follow the protocol. So how to develop a new therapy? This is the most exciting part. I just give you an example. It is, for example, a healthy worm. You take the worm and you transfer that worm into a patient avatar or a model system. So imagine mutant worms. They are all genetically modified. And then when you have them, obviously they are different from your healthy worm. And then you test different drugs or procedures and try to cure the worm. So, of course, you don't know which drug will help. So you use a so-called drug screen. You figure out what is the characteristic of your disease, which is the most important for you. So that would be your readoff. It could be, for example, enzyme activity or glycosylation or growth or survival. And after you treated your mutant worms with the different drugs, you will pick those worms which are the closest to your healthy worms. So after you picked your favorites, you can go and validate your findings. Take, for example, a patient fibroblast, so samples in a dish from the patient, and see whether the same drugs will give the same benefit in the patient cells. So this we will call in vitro studies and validation of our findings. You probably want to know how long this takes. And the timeline can be very different depending on how complicated is your model. In case of worms, usually you can make the mutant avatars in a few months. However, a drug screen can take many, many months. And if you test that in fibroblasts, an additional 3-4 months. So at least a year is necessary, even with optimistic measures, to have some candidate medications. So are we ready to start clinical trials if we found a great candidate intervention or drug? If you look at this first part of this graph, you see in vitro and in vivo testing. So you see, this is the part when you use those patient avatars or animal models or cell models. If you have convincing data, you can submit a so-called IND application, which is an application to the FDA stating that you have promising results, nice experimental proof, and you want to try that new target drug or intervention in your patients. If you're lucky and you get accepted, for example, a single patient IND, then you can try it in a one patient, but you can also use that information to design a clinical trial, for example, safety trial, and try it in volunteers, or even try it in patients. There is a long way to treatment development, and all the data is reviewed by the FDA before they approve it, and even surveyed further. So this really long process usually takes several years, especially if that drug is not an already known drug in the US, like a repurposed drug we were talking about earlier. So here's the timeline for this part. And you see, we start with the in vitro validation process. And then hopefully we can start a single patient trial. So let's imagine that we are preparing for a single patient IND based on promising studies. we found candidate drugs for either CDG or NGLY1. So what we do, we enroll our patients to the natural history studies to learn as much as possible about their baseline health situation and have enough data to compare that to the data we'll collect on therapy. So what's the next step? The next step is submit that IND, which is usually a lot of paperwork. So imagine that you have to collect all the literature about that drug, all the scientific preliminary results, and make a case for why you want to use this new thing, a new drug or intervention in a patient. So you can do a single patient treatment trial for 6 months or a year, but at least 6 months to have enough data to then decide, I want to design a clinical trial based on these results. Then the IND can take 4 to 6 months because of the number of documents you have to design and thoroughly build. And then, of course, even if the FDA accepts it, then it has to go to your institutional IRB, which can take additional month. And then maybe then you're ready to start your trial. So what's important for the success of clinical trials? You really have to collect thorough baseline information. That's why Christina talked to you so much in depth about the relevance of natural history studies. And that's how we as FCDGC approaches this question as well. We try to include as many patients into our natural history studies as possible to have a large enough sample size and to be able to design really good clinical trials. It's important to have reliable outcome measures. So really something which remains stable during the natural course of disease. Imagine just, for example, CDG patients, sometimes they have more severe abnormalities when they do the CDG test in blood. Sometimes it can normalize even without intervention. So we really have to design the outcome measures which are independent from just faith or natural course of disease. And as we discussed, we really have to be unbiased. So then let's talk about biomarkers. Biomarkers are also important because they can give additional information about the success of the trial, and we can use it to enroll patients in the natural in clinical trials, and it can be also used to be evaluated eligibility and outcome. So biomarkers can be in blood or from urine. They can be skin fibroblasts. We can test the drugs in fibroblasts, for example, and measure the biomarkers. So what's expected from subjects enrolled in a clinical trial? A clinical study protocol is a document that describes the objectives, the assessment types, the collection schedules. So everything about how we do the trial and also how to protect our subjects from any harm. So the subjects really need to follow the protocol for of the study. Otherwise, the protocol won't be successful. Most clinical trials offer some kind of support, reimbursement, or an incentive to participate. So our patients will be able to get to the study sites and their travel is supported. Many of you asked, even before this educational event, if virtual visits are possible or off-site data collection is possible. You have to specify it in your protocol, and then you're able to do that. But there are some measurements you cannot do at a different site. Some of the really important disease-specific data collection should happen at the site where you're enrolled to the study. So here is an example for a study protocol, just to show you, to be able to imagine how it goes. So the study protocol will start with a baseline data collection. So it's like physical exam, vitals, some blood work, maybe collecting urine for a possible biomarker we will follow throughout the trial. And ICAR is just an example, a very complex neurological scoring system, which would give you disease severity data. Maybe the next 2 visits will be totally virtual because you only need to know about the patient if the patient's doing well and having vitals. But usually within 3 months, we will have a second visit with physical and vitals and blood work to see whether the treatment or the intervention works. And then, of course, in the course of the study, several other appointments are possible. So what happens to clinical care during the clinical trial? That was also a question you were struggling with. So of course, the patients will continue to receive standard clinical care in addition to their trial follow-up appointments. Patients who are enrolled in clinical trials continue to take their medication as well, but we warn them not to start an experimental therapy during the trial. You also asked whether insurance pays any of the aspects of clinical trials. Of course, when you are enrolled in care and clinical trial at the same time, all those measurements, imaging, and clinical appointments, which will be part of your clinical care, will be still covered by insurance. But what's only specific for the trial, that won't be. And hopefully the clinical trial will support you for these extra costs. Another important question was whether you can stop if you start and it's just too much and you cannot handle the schedule or your child doesn't want to participate anymore. Of course, you can stop anytime. You can even switch to another trial if you feel like there is another trial which would be a better fit for your child. But we don't encourage you for that because that trial you started, if you step out of it, maybe there won't be enough patients to finish the trial and have an answer for all the people who went through and gave their time and offered their help for that clinical trial. So the best if you decide and then you try to keep and stay with us till the end. So here I close with a couple of the ABCs, a few definitions. You were asking about eligibility is according to the enrollment criteria. So specifically defined in the protocol who is eligible for a study. This could be based on diagnosis or age or specific biomarker detected, or maybe even in vitro studies in a patient's cells, which suggest that you have benefit from a certain drug. Enrollment criteria usually include the genetic background and specific disease characteristics. The procedures, they sound horrible, but usually these are normal studies, what you have otherwise as well, blood work, EKG, liver ultrasound, or physical exam. Recruitment could be active with reaching out to patients with enrollment criteria, or you can look up a study and you can just request to be enrolled as well. and success and that we are doing this together, thanks to CDG Care. So now I would like to finish with a patient interview. Maggie has been my patient for more than 2 years now, and Maggie has been participating in a single patient clinical trial. I cannot believe that it's more than 15 months now since we started, and I asked her mother how she survived this rocky road we had together in the past year.
Hi, thank you for coming and joining us today, because I have a couple of personal questions for you about clinical trials. You just finished a 1-year clinical trial with the experimental drug Eporestat. You helped developing this drug to come to this trial phase. And I was just focusing on doing this trial right and collecting my data appropriately, and not to forget when to order certain things for you. And I haven't even stopped thinking like, oh my God, I drag you here every second month. You traveled. Maggie got 5 liters of blood draw probably in a year, was tortured by different imaging studies and clinicians. And so I really want to know what was the commitment from you for this 1 year really busy period. And if you could just start to tell us, what does it mean for you and your family to do this? And if you could also tell us, what do you think how Maggie experienced this very busy period and very stressful period we have behind us?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I'm honored, as always, to talk with you, and very grateful for your leadership and work. I can't thank you enough for doing this trial for Maggie. It is a big commitment to do a clinical trial. I think it would be false to say that it's not. We travel, we live in Michigan, so it's about an 8-hour drive to Mayo Clinic, and we drive now after COVID. We were flying previously. And so there's certainly a lot of just travel arrangements and, or coordinating where you'll stay and eat and all of your appointment times and staying on schedule and adjusting to a time change if you're coming from a different time zone. And so there's some elements there, and I'm fortunate enough that we can, have support when we travel and bring a caretaker with us so that I can juggle all of the various things. And I feel very lucky to be able to do that and to easily travel, I guess, have that flexibility and financing to do so. So I think it's really important for clinical trials to have that. I can't stress that enough for any sponsors of clinical trials, that's an important aspect. From the standpoint of taking the drug, I know initially there was obviously a lot of fear. You're scared, right? Like your kid's Maggie was the first kid that I know of. It was a geriatric or adult drug. And so that was a little scary, and weighing the options of what if we do harm? What if we do something bad? I think that's where the importance of those steps you talked about in the protocol and all of the safety reviews and evaluations and all of that time that it takes to go through those steps are for that reason. It's important to keep patients safe, and that's a really big aspect of it. And the protocol does go through it's a very thick packet that gives you, it's like signing a mortgage. You're going through all of the paperwork to know all of the steps, all of the different exams they would do, including, of course, blood draws. Now, Maggie I'm very lucky. She's a trooper. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, like Dr. Ava Marava, of course. And so she loves participating in medical activities. So I'm very fortunate. She's very brave. There's times where she gets, nervous or anxious about something that's coming up. But she's very much a trooper. I'm very lucky in that regard. And I know that if it were my son, it would be very, very hard because he is completely opposite of her and would not want to go through all of those steps. And when we give her the drug, she takes it, it's a pill. So, and we taught her how to swallow pills throughout this process. I know that was something we were worried about. Are we going to have to open and sprinkle it possibly? But she takes it. She does take it 4 times a day. So that's every 6 hours, which means we do, her dad and I have to commit to one of us is doing the late night pill and waking her up and giving it to her. But for us, it's certainly been worth it and then some. I mean, we've gotten some huge quality of life gains. We feel like from the trial through her stability and her speech and her fine motor and some of her even just her learning. She's a first grader this year, so she's working on reading and sight words. And I just, when I talk to her teachers and those that have known her before the trial and after, they see a big difference. And so it certainly can be worth it. And that wouldn't be to say every clinical trial you join, you're going to have those results and there's going to be this magic wand. We all want that, of course. And I probably stupidly, when we first ventured down this path, thought that there would be 2 options. We'd either find a cure and be magic, or we'd find nothing. And of course, it was somewhere in between. And that's probably would have been more realistic to think of. But yeah.
So if we could start again, what would you do differently? How did you tell Maggie that we are doing this? And did you need to convince her, or you just said, well, this is what we do? And again, would you do anything different?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. If I were to do anything different, I would do more videos of her and more documentation, because I think back now, I wish I would have done more of that to kind of see and watch her progression and try to keep better track on that, because I didn't want to get my hopes up. Hope is like a dangerous drug in itself. I don't think there's any placebo for it. And you don't want to get too hopeful that something's happening. And so it took me a long time of saying, no, that's probably nothing. That's maybe just normal, development. Mm-hmm. And if I did anything differently, I would probably document more. As far as talking to Maggie about it, she's really what drives, our family to look for things. She wants to run. She wants to go do everything. She wants to be a doctor. So she is a very happy girl, and she has a good life, and she brings joy to the world, but she wants to do more. And so you want, as a parent, to do everything you can to give that to her, and of course, give her the best life possible.
That's a wonderful final word. I think this is the time we have, but there will be possibilities to ask some questions, of course. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Our final speaker, and certainly not least, is Dr. Edmondson, and Andrea is going to introduce him, after which I'll bring up his slides and he will be presenting in real time.
Hi, everybody. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Edmondson, who is the attending physician of human genetics and metabolism at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is also the founding director of the CDG clinic at CHOP, where he diagnoses and manages CDG patients with complex multisystemic disease manifestations. Dr. Edmondson is working to develop a research program that's focused on clarifying the critical role of glycosylation in human neurodevelopment, understanding the mechanisms of CDG pathophysiology, and developing novel CDG-centric therapies at CHOP. Dr. Edmondson is also a committed member of the CDG Care Medical Advisory Board, and we're very happy that he's here with us today. Thank you.
All right. Can we get back to my first slide?
Yes, just a second.
So welcome everyone for all the snafus of live presentations that we're, I guess, trying to avoid with our videos. But I'm grateful to, be here to be presenting, and thankful for everyone who's shown up, who's, here. Thanks for sticking with us, sticking through all of our pre-recorded presentations, and hope that you're finding this to be useful for you. So I'm going to talk about the future of clinical trials, where we are currently, where we're going, and particularly in relation to CDG clinical trials. How far away are they for us? And I want to talk about specifically how you now, as patients and families, can really partner with the CDG professionals to ensure that the clinical trials we're building towards and designing will really meet your needs. So to do this, we're going to talk a little bit again, return to this timeline of drug approval and where we are and where clinical trials stand within that. And so as we've been sharing with you, the timeline for drug approval begins with an idea or discovery, and that's where the drug development process begins, and then goes through many steps before we get to clinical trials. This can take a long time, as Dr. Moravo emphasized, but there's the possibility to take drugs that are already approved, to bypass many of these steps, and to move to specific clinical trials for the disease of interest through a process called drug repurposing. And so, there's multiple ways to get through this, but once you get to the clinical trial stage, there's multiple stages for those clinical trials. So here's a zoom in of those clinical trial phases, with phase 1 being an initial stage, primarily looking at, is the drug safe in the studied patient population? Phase 2, looking at more patients and trying to determine if the drug is effective as well as safe. And then phase 3, moving into even larger populations before market approval to try and determine how effective it is, and if there's specific subpopulations within the broader population that have more or less benefit or more or less safety side effects from the drug. But this can be a really long process. So to again put some of this in perspective, I want to talk about the history of clinical trials that we've had so far in CDG. And basically, early on in the discovery of CDG, it was recognized that you could use Manos therapy to treat a very specific type of CDG, MPI CDG, with really drastic improvements in health. And this has led to CDG being thought of as a group of diseases that are amenable to clinical trials, to developing specific treatments for the condition. But there's some challenges that we've had, and so the study designs so far for CDG, including for MPI CDG, have largely been N of 1 trials, have been open label trials, and have been nutritional supplements. And so these types of study designs have not been amenable to going after market approval, having market releases and regulatory reviews. So we haven't done any of those based on these prior trials. So this has been a challenge because of the small patient population and being able to move forward with these clinical trials. But we're trying to change that. So we've talked a lot about the natural history study and through the studies that are now available to US participants in the Frontiers in CDG Consortium, which consists of natural history study that Dr. Lamb described, biomarker discovery, and some initial clinical trials to try and position ourselves to be ready to do clinical trials in CDG. And this Frontier in CDG Consortium is really an investment from the US National Institutes of Health to prepare the CDG patient population to be ready for clinical trials. And so they support us in the consortium by providing financial resources so that we're able to pursue these studies, a professional review of our trial designs to make sure that it's really robust, that it stands up to the scrutiny that the FDA will do to our data, so that we can be prepared to answer their questions if we have treatments that we think are worth broader market approval and treatment in CDG. They also provide us with the data management infrastructure to collect all of the data from the natural history study and to be able to analyze it properly. And they provide us with peer connections with other rare disease groups. So we're a relatively young rare disease group, and there are rare disease groups that have been around and established through these consortiums for longer. And so they help us connect with them so that we can all, as various rare disease communities, come together and share our successes and share the challenges that we all face as rare disease groups, so that we can overcome these challenges together and we can learn from what other rare disease groups are doing. We think it's really important to have patients and families involved, that we think it's critical to success. And the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network recognized this and really required that we have a patient advocacy organization involved in our consortium. And they have proven instrumental. As Dr. Morava often says, the patient advocacy groups, so CDG Care and other groups, are really our biggest strengths as part of our consortium. And so where do we stand on the CDG clinical trial timeline specifically? So we'll go over what's available really now, what is going to be available soon, what will be available later, and then what does the future look like for CDG clinical trials. So what's available right now for particularly US patients and families, but broadly speaking, are the CDG natural history studies that Dr. Lamb talked about. Those aren't really clinical trials. There's not an intervention, but this is what is currently available. In addition, there is one clinical trial currently open, available, and enrolling for one specific CDG type, PMM2 CDG, which is looking at acetazolamide to improve ataxia in PMM2 CDG. This is a double-blind study where patients don't know what drug they're on, that physicians don't know what drug patients are on, to really evaluate in a very rigorous fashion, is acetazolamide useful? This study is currently enrolling at Seattle Children's and at Mayo Clinic, and very soon we'll be enrolling at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Soon, so there's a list of things that are becoming available in the next year to two, I would say, maybe under a year for some of these that are available for a variety of CDG types, primarily various nutritional supplements that are intended to be studied in a rigorous fashion in specific CDG types. But also the Palrostat that Dr. Morava and the patient family interview that we just shared with you is also looking at. So that is coming soon. We're working hard on these. A little bit later, not exactly clear when, is the mannose-1 phosphate replacement therapy, again for PMN2 CDG, which is the drug that's being developed by Glycomine. So for those of you who are in the Glycomine natural history study, may be aware of that. So that's coming down a little bit later. And then the future is still an open question. We're actively working to move us there, but I think the future is bright, and we want to work towards that brighter future together with you. What does the future look like in general for clinical trials? So the FDA, various regulatory bodies are really trying to help us to increase the convenience for subjects in clinical trials, being able to include telemedicine visits, electronic surveys, other ways that are less onerous for patient participation. We're looking at finding better ways to collect data, things like wearable biosensor devices, cell phone app-based data capture, things that will produce really reliable and ongoing data collection. And then we're looking to develop clinical trials that have more meaningful outcomes. And so this is looking at patient-reported outcome measures, a lot of this being developed through the World CDG Group, as well as looking at outcomes with really meaningful patient impact. So not looking for minor changes in biomarkers that are real, but don't have any impact on how you as patient families experience the disease. We really want to make sure that the clinical trials we conduct are going to have outcomes that are meaningful for you. So returning to this timeline that I shared at the beginning of my presentation, and talking about getting future CDG treatments, it's a long road, and where do we stand on this? And this leads to some of the questions that we've gotten in preparing for this presentation of why are there clinical trials only available for some CDG types? And what does it take to create interest in establishing a clinical trial for a specific CDG type? So as CDG professionals, we are interested in being able to have treatments for all CDG types. We're interested in developing clinical trials for all CDG types, but why aren't they there? And that's because really it begins with an idea or a discovery. And so for some CDG types, we've had ideas or discoveries that have panned out with the various initial studies that make it seem like they're good for pursuing a clinical trial. For other CDG types, we haven't yet had those ideas or discoveries, but we're actively soliciting that information, trying to make new discoveries that will give us those ideas of how we can develop clinical trials. So this is the first place that you as families can work with us and help us. So we at the Frontiers in CDG Consortium, as well as at CDG Care, are actively soliciting basic science ideas, translational science ideas, and research opportunities to try and start this process for any and all CDG types. So CDG Care does a lot of fundraising for money to help support these. We have grant money through the Frontiers in CDG Consortium from NIH to also support these. And you can help us to share this information with others and help us to come up with ideas of what we could do to develop a clinical trial for your specific CDG type. And you can work with CDG Care specifically, as a rare disease group to help encourage additional interest and ideas here at the beginning of the pipeline. It's also important in developing clinical trials and having new CDG treatments to create this perception of achievable success. And that's also part of what we're doing at Frontiers in CDG Consortium in putting together the natural history studies to show that we have engaged patients, that we have developed a solid research infrastructure to carry out these clinical trials, and that we'll be able to translate these early successes into successes within clinical trial. And so having you as an engaged population, having you enroll in our natural history studies is also really useful. Another important aspect of the natural history study that Dr. Lamb mentioned is the goal attainment score, or the 3 wishes. And this is your opportunity to let us know what are the most significant disease symptoms that you experience, and what would be the disease symptoms that a clinical trial should address most significantly to improve your experience of having the disease, and show us what are those meaningful outcomes that we need to target in clinical trials. As we begin developing clinical trials, you can also give us insight into what are the appropriate and acceptable study designs, what are the types of clinical trials you'd be willing to enroll in, what are the acceptable study procedures, what is the accepted frequency of coming for a visit, so that we can design clinical trials that will meet FDA and other regulatory board standards, but that will also meet your needs and will be attractive for having you join in the clinical trial and participate along with us as we work to discover truly efficacious treatments for CDG. And then after clinical trials are completed, if the data looks promising and we move forward with trying to get broader approval, patient families can really do a lot in the regulatory review and decision-making process to advocate for treatments. And so there's a really important role for there at the back end after the clinical trials. So, to review how we build a brighter future of clinical trials in CDG together, the roles specifically for patients and families are to help raise awareness of CDG. So this has been going on for several years with all of the CDG awareness days. We're coming up in mid-May of having another CDG awareness day. And so helping us in those efforts and working with CDG Care to raise awareness will help to increase the interest of companies in developing treatments in CDG, as well as just overall improving awareness. Coordinate with patient advocacy groups on your advocacy efforts, and then provide us with the meaningful trial outcomes and feedbacks on those acceptable and unacceptable trial designs, as well as coordinating with CDG Care and other patient advocacy groups to make sure that we're supporting the research priorities that will start that process of being able to develop a clinical trial for your specific CDG type. Additionally, some very specific things that you can do. We talked about patient registries and those being important. So there's the CDG Connect International Patient Registry. So this is something that all patients anywhere in the world can sign up for. It's hosted through Invitae, partnered with CDG Care, and a very recent partner that we're grateful for, CDG Canada, to collect information about CDG patients. And in developing our Frontiers in CDG Consortium, this registry was absolutely essential for us. Many times going to CDG Care and asking them for additional data on CDG types, numbers we have, symptoms that are reported through some of the surveys in this registry has been really useful as we started to design things. And so this is a way for international patients to make themselves seen and heard about the CDG types that are out there and that would be willing to participate in clinical trials, and what the disease symptoms are that we need to address. You can also sign up for the CDG Care Family Support Network. So this is another way to get involved, to have your voice heard. And this was recently launched by CDG Care. So we invite you through their website to also sign up for their support network, and you can indicate your interest in being contacted and how CDG Care can support you and reach out to you about research opportunities. the next thing that everyone, all CDG patients and families can do is really attend the 5th World CDG World Conference. So this, for the first time, is going to be offered as an online conference. The move to doing many things virtually with COVID has reduced the barrier to attend, which is a conference usually held in Europe, and it's challenging for US families to attend, but all families can sign up and go. And this is a great conference specifically about bringing patient voices to the table with CDG professionals and drug developers. So I've been really impressed with this conference. I would really encourage any interested families to sign up and attend the World Conference on CDG. Additionally, for US patients, there's the FCDGC Natural History Study open to all CDG patients in the United States. Here's the website, so you can go and identify if there's a site near you or that you'd be willing to travel to, and the contact information so that you can sign up and get involved in helping us to collect the initial information that we need about CDG and its natural history study so that we can design clinical trials. And then the final thing is to think about, of the available clinical trials, is one appropriate for you? Dr. Lamb talked about where those become available on the clinical trial, the government clinical trial site. We also have 3 sites available for clinical trials in the Frontiers in CDG Consortium. Currently, the only clinical trial that we're running in our consortium is the acetazolamide trial in PMM2 CDG. So if that's your CDG type, think about it, reach out to the sites that are performing these studies, get the additional information you need, and think about whether it's appropriate for you and your family to enroll. And as additional clinical trials become available, looking to see if they are appropriate for you, and as we're designing them, letting us know how we need to design these clinical trials so that they will be appropriate for you. And with that, I thank everyone for their attendance today, and we're going to move on to some polls and some further engagement in answering some questions.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're just taking a little bit of a transition. I don't know if anyone needs a bathroom break, so I was thinking we would give a 2-minute bathroom break just so that everyone can maybe get something to drink, because we're going to go into a Q&A session. I don't want to lose too much time here, but just want to give a 2 minutes, and then we're bringing up for the Q&A. We have some great questions, and I see that we didn't have everyone who registered come on the platform, so we want to ask the right questions. So we'll explain to you in a few moments how to ask your questions, because we do want to make sure we're asking and answering questions for the people who are on the system. I don't know if anyone's, okay, 1 or 2 have just taken a little break. So we'll come back to the polls first, and then we'll go into the Q&A. All right, so what we'll do now, I think, just one more moment. But I know I've enjoyed listening to the content, and I just want to thank all our speakers, our physicians, who have taken a lot of time over the last few weeks to prepare this material and make sure it was exactly coordinated between our speakers. So I really want us to thank them for taking the time, because obviously they have to also see patients, and they're even taking the time today. So whatever time they take to be here today, they're taking away from other patients, but wanting to make sure that they can use this in the future, this material in the future as well, for other patients, even in other regions of the world. So I believe it will be very useful. So we're going to run a poll right now, and this is just for patients and parents. These polls are for patients and parents. And we would like to run the one on the patient registries first. So if you could just let us know your thoughts on the patient registries. Still can't see how, okay. You should be able to take the poll, and it's asking, have you or your child ever enrolled in a CDG or NGLY1 patient registry? If you're a co-host, I don't think you can see it, but if you can't see it, how to put your response in. We've got a few more people coming in now. Those are the results we see so far. Have you or your child ever enrolled in a CDG or NGLY1? We've still got some, about 29% have said no, and some are not sure. So we'll go into the patient room afterwards, and we want to make sure that you're clear on whether you are involved in a patient registry. The next one I'd like to do is the natural history studies. So we'll put up the natural history studies. Have you or your child ever enrolled in a CDG? Enrolled in a natural history study? Okay. So still got quite a number who have never enrolled in a natural history study. So we'll go now to the clinical trials. Let's go to clinical trials and see who's been involved in clinical trials for this condition. So most have not been involved in any clinical trials. So that's to be expected because you're just beginning to move through the clinical trial process. So we'll close out for now, but we'll come back with one final poll, because it's all right to say what you haven't done, but what do you intend to do, I think is more important probably. So now I'd like to go to our questions, and we do not have everyone who registered on the platform, and I believe we may have some parents and patients who want to ask questions. So we want to make sure we give you the opportunity to ask questions. So the way that we'd like to do this is, if you see reactions down at the bottom of your screen, you can raise your hand and we will make sure that we come to you to ask, so that you can ask your question. You can just raise a hand, just show the hand raising using the reactions. So we don't see any, okay, we see someone, Andrew, Conrad, Katsuoka. Let me just take a question first, go to Dr. Morava. You very kindly interviewed, I think it's Holly, regarding her child. How did you decide to do this patient individual IND and clinical trial? What was the thought process in putting that together? Because I'm sure a lot of other parents would be wondering, would my child qualify for such a clinical trial?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think that what the title of my presentation was, Your Voice Matters. The unmet need came from the patients. We had some drug targets based on scientific data in worms and in patient cell lines, and that encouraged us that if that drug works in an animal model, or if that new drug works in patient cell lines, and that's a drug which has a relatively okay safety profile, then we can try that drug in a human person. I think this is an opportunity for different CDG types. This could be opportunity for NGLY1. There are several scientific ideas about potential repurposed or repurposable drugs, which were shown to have positive effect in either an animal model or in a drug screening. And these are potential targets we could translate to single patient INDs if we think that the drug is safe enough to try it in a child or in a young adult.
Thank you. I just want to bring to your attention that if you see the poll still up, you can close the poll yourself. I see it on my other screen. So just if you do still see it, just close it. And that way it's not obscuring your view. Yes, it's very easy to close. So we do have a question from Andrew. Andrew, why don't you ask your question? And if you could say who you would like to answer it.
Hello. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for including us in this webinar. I have found it to be a really excellent webinar. I'm the sister of a patient with CDG SSR4. So he is NGLY1. And I would really like to know, my question relates to moving from the natural history study to clinical trials. And what determines whether a certain CDG patient is ready to move from a natural history study to clinical trials? Would it be level of basic data evidence or number of patients in the studies or level of drug development? If someone could comment on that, whether Dr. Edmondson or Dr. Morava or Dr. Lamb.
Yeah, happy to address that. So moving to a clinical trial, the first thing needs to be that a clinical trial is available that's appropriate for the patient to move into the clinical trial from the natural history study. So for NGLY1 specifically, we need to have a study that has inclusion criteria for NGLY1 patients. And then there's a number of additional inclusion and exclusion criteria that becomes a very patient-specific decision of, do they have all of the necessary requirements to be in that clinical trial? And do they not have any of the exclusion criteria? So exclusion criteria for some clinical trials may be particular lab abnormalities that would suggest there's an increased risk for that patient being in the clinical trial that we don't think is yet acceptable for them. So if the trial is available, if the inclusion criteria are met and none of the exclusion criteria are met, then that patient would be deemed eligible to move into the clinical trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. So that's very helpful.
Okay, good. And obviously, regarding clinical trials, I really like what Dr. Edmondson said. Having an engaged patient population encourages companies to begin to work in these diseases, because I've seen and been told about studies that were set up and there was not a single patient to go into the study. Maybe they designed a very challenging study to go into, but the last thing any company wants is to spend a lot of money setting up a study, which is a very expensive process, and then to find there's nobody to go into the study. But the fact that you're here today helps to ensure companies get the assurance, and we do have some on today, that we have an engaged patient group that's organized, because I'm involved with some other groups and they're not as well organized. And I think the leadership is so critical in rare disease. You've got physicians are very engaged. They want to get things moving. You've got Andrea's group want to move things forward and provide leadership. And she's very good at the fundraising as well, because there's a lot of funding that's needed. So I really appreciate working with this group, because I've seen a difference in some of the other groups that I've observed. And without good leadership, it's very difficult to even get started with some clinical trials. So I think you're in good hands here. And Gemma Lang. So Gemma, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yes, hello. Thank you for all the speakers today. We've just got a general question regarding...
Gemma, do I detect a British accent?
Yes, you do.
Oh, have you on?
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're over in the UK today. We were just wondering if families are willing to travel and the patient is meets the eligibility criteria, are they able to access and enroll in some of the studies or trials at the moment?
So let's have Dr. Morava. Yes, go ahead.
The answer is yes, but this is an amazing commitment from our patients and families. So what we started to do is one possibility is enrolling patients into natural history studies to collect baseline data, because we do share that, and that belongs to the CDG community. And that's possible from abroad as well as part of a virtual visit when we have a good partner in the home country who helps to collect that data. For clinical trials, to travel so far away, that's sort of cruel, I would say. And I'm not saying you shouldn't come, but what we plan to do with our FCDGC consortium is reach out to experts in Europe and try to include them in our consortium and establish clinical sites which are in network with us, and try to have the same trials available in Europe as we established here in the US. Right now, we are working on working with two European partners. One is in Leuven, Belgium, and the other one is with Eric Eklund in Scandinavia. And obviously, we don't want to stop there. Just it needs a lot of paperwork and ethical agreements and regulatory documents.
So I just want to add also, Gemma, whereabouts do you live? Are you in London area or where are you?
It doesn't, we're not far from London. It wouldn't take long to get there.
Yeah, because you may be under a specialist, and if you can encourage your specialist, so starting with your GP, of course, to encourage the specialist to get involved with the studies that you find of interest, then there is a process that has to be gone through. But with any of the specialist centers in London and elsewhere, any of the major cities, there will be, I'm sure there will be physicians who would be interested, but sometimes they may not be aware of what's going on. And so you are probably more engaged, and they may be treating a range of conditions. And if you can bring to their attention that this study is a study that could be brought to the UK, if it's not already there, or the studies that you're interested in, then there is a way around that. So you don't have to travel all the way to the US or even to Sweden, although that might be a nice trip and we can travel again. But it's not insurmountable. I just want to stress that. Because even when other patients also look at clinicaltrials.gov and you see a list of countries and your country is not listed, if you can take the same action, identify your specialists, and ask them if they would be interested, obviously, in taking part in a clinical trial. And if you're not under a specialist, they may need to be trained in good clinical practice. But with an ultra-rare disease, which these are, we need as many sites as possible. Now, each site is expensive, so we have to make sure they're committed to the process. So that's a way around that. And then Christina, okay, thank you very much. And then Christina Dehen, can you ask your question and let us know who you would like to answer that?
Yes, I'm actually wondering, I've been working with Ann and Steve Nguyen, and my son has the CDG and the PIGA. And I'm wondering, right now we are in the natural history studies portion right now. Is there any interest in doing anything further than that at this time? And I don't know who would know the answer to that, so.
So I do know that there is some research, so lab research that's ongoing, working towards a gene therapy for PIGA. It's not ready for clinical trials yet, but there are definitely therapeutic, hopefully in the future, there will be therapeutic trials. There are also a few thoughts about different therapies, although no actual open clinical trials at this point. So as Dr. Edmondson said, you would know when clinical trial would be available by looking at a site, for example, like clinicaltrials.gov, to see if there is a trial that your child is eligible for. But we are moving from a preclinical point of view towards treatment.
Yeah, I'll just add on, if you think about the timeline that I shared, we're very early for PIGA in that idea to preclinical studies as we're moving there. So there's lots of interest to go there. It's just not available for clinical trials yet. The other thing I'll say about knowing when a clinical trial is available is that if you're in our natural history studies, we'll reach out to you as well when we know there's a clinical trial that might be appropriate for you to consider. So that's, I guess, another plug for why to get involved in natural history studies and in patient registries. Those things I was plugging as, the patient registries, getting involved in the CDG support network will be other ways that will more actively reach out to you to let you know when clinical trials are available for your specific CDG type.
Bobby List, you could ask your question, please. Bobby List.
Yes, hi. It seemed like there are 3 possible trials available for PMM2. I was just wondering if any of the doctors could give a recommendation for other families out there that may be saying, which of those 3 would be the right trial for my child? How do you go about making a recommendation? Theoretically, if the glycomine and the acetazolamide and amparostat were all ready at the same time, how would you know which would be the best one to pursue?
And I recommend that we all pick one, and then maybe I start with Eparestat, and my colleagues can comment on the other 2 upcoming trials or currently ongoing trials. So just about the Eparestat trial, it seems like there is a way to define inclusion criteria for that trial. There are 2 ways we can screen a patient for potential eligibility. One way is, you have to know first that that drug works in a way that the enzyme, which is necessary to have a good CDG or a good glycosylation function, is called PMM2. And this drug increases the activity of this enzyme. So in order to decide whether your child or family member is a good candidate for a potential trial, we usually recommend a skin biopsy that we can measure the enzyme activity, treat the cells with the drug, and see if the cells show improvement. The other way we can screen a patient for eligibility is looking for a biomarker. It's in the urine. So we test a urine sample for this metabolite, which seems to correlate with some disease aspects we plan to improve in the disease. That's specifically the neuropathy, so the distal weakness of the extremities. So either of the 2, the skin biopsy treated with the drug showing promising results, or the presence of the biomarker in the urine showing this metabolite, which correlates with disease severity and the nerve involvement. If we find these, then we recommend that that person should be a good fit for the upcoming trial, which is not recruiting yet because we are still working on paperwork and ethical issues. We only did a single patient for that. So then maybe I pass on to Christina to tell about the acetazolamide?
Sure, I can talk about acetazolamide. For acetazolamide, the target in terms of what we're trying to improve mainly is balance or ataxia. So if your child or the person who's interested has balance issues, then that would be one possible reason to consider acetazolamide. In addition, individuals that are qualified or are eligible, I guess, for the trial would be those that are 4 or older. The reason for that is because the measurement of balance cannot be really performed in individuals that are younger reliably. And in general, balance improves as you get through the toddler age. So it'd be impossible to tell if the medication is actually of any benefit, just because as you're a toddler, you don't have balance. And as you get older, you should have improved balance in general. So for people who are interested in acetazolamide, if there are difficulties with balance or dysarthria, which is pronunciation in speech, and they're older than 4, then they would be eligible as long as they meet safety criteria. Also, I know that the question initially was a hypothetical if all 3 trials were available at the same time. So in fact, at this point, not all 3 trials are available at the same time. For the therapeutic, the double-blind portion of the acetazolamide study, which is the critical piece of gathering information as to whether or not this therapeutic works, that does take 6 months. And so during the 6 months, it would be ideal if an individual wouldn't drop out and start another therapeutic trial. But then after especially that first 6 months, if the individual would need to drop out for another therapeutic trial and wash out of that, then it would be possible that, especially if the timeline is such that the other trials are up at that point, it would be possible for an individual to maybe participate in different clinical trials.
I guess that leaves me to discuss glycomine, which, to emphasize, is on my timeline of later things that's coming down the road. So it's not available now either. So yeah, I think as Dr. Marava and Dr. Lamb have shared with us, the first thing is what's available. PMM2 CDG is getting into the place where there may be multiple available at one time. And so then the first question, I think, is what are you actually eligible for? There are going to be differing eligibility criteria for different trials. Dr. Lamb talked about age criteria, as well as there's some laboratory criteria. Dr. Marava talked about some biomarker or cellular-based evidence that you'd be eligible for that criteria. And it's likely that glycomine, when they come up with their criteria, will also have very specific criteria. The next thing is something that I referred to in my presentation, which is, I think, a very personal decision. So talking to your CDG specialist, determining what is most likely to be helpful for you or your patient, your family member for the trial. What are the symptoms that are most concerning, and would a particular treatment maybe be targeting those symptoms better than others? And then the second thing is, what are the ongoing requirements of being in that clinical trial, and is one of them a better fit for you personally, for your family, for the types of assessments, the frequency of assessments, the travel that may be required? It's likely that would be a higher bar. I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb for glycomine. I think that it's going to require more frequent evaluations, and will probably require observed administration of their medication rather than a pill you can take at home. So I think that that's also going to be a big impact on which trial is maybe the best trial that's available and appropriate for you. But it comes down to what is actually you're eligible for initially, and then second, looking at the specifics of that trial and whether it works for you and whether it's something you're interested in.
Right, I can take, go ahead, Dr. Marava.
I just thought that Horacio is on this call, and maybe he has some updates on glycomine trial, because I think we haven't received an update since the last patient CDG care meeting. I'm not sure if he wants to talk, but I saw he's here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you, and thanks for those excellent presentations and very exciting news. So yeah, briefly, as most of you know, in Glycoman, we are working on replacement therapy trying for a PMM2 CDG, where the idea is to provide the -1 phosphate that these patients need. And we are getting closer to studies. The FDA has asked us to start giving our drug to healthy volunteers, which we're planning to do later this year. And we are planning to start a study in adults with the disease. That's another thing that we're asked to start with adults and then go down in age sometime next year. We're going to run our studies in the US and Europe. We are also planning to start a study with the adolescents soon after the adults. And then if we find that the drug is safe and it shows efficacy and changes the biomarkers, we are going to extend this to younger patients.
Thank you very much for that. I do see that we have a couple of other people raising hands. We're going to take that into the patient room because I'd like to make sure we close out on time, because a lot of people have to go elsewhere and I don't want to keep them too long. So we're just going to invite you into the patient room. We can take additional questions in the patient room. So I am going to share my screen and go to the remaining few slides. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. So just want to show you a few of the websites and social media contacts for putting rare diseases patients first. Again, we provide more general information that may be of use to you, but also when we're covering specific diseases, it may also be of use to you to see how things are done with other rare diseases. We have a meeting on the 28th of May, which is regarding sickle cell disease, and there we're talking about gene therapy approaches, gene editing approaches, transplantation approaches. So it's a little bit of a different disease area, but there they are already looking at gene editing. Bluebird Bio have already cured some patients with this very challenging disease. So I know some of you are already thinking along those lines. We'd like you to take the research survey. We run a research survey. We want 1,000 patients from different rare diseases in the survey. This would be a white paper, but also a publication. We get a lot of requests for publications. We want to publish information on what's happening in the rare disease space with real parents, real patients, going through the challenges of rare disease. It takes about 10 minutes to do the research survey. I think we probably have 1 or 2 people from the CDG and GLY1 group, but we'd love to have a few more. And as I said, we probably have just under 100 so far. We're aiming for 1,000. So we get a real sample of what's going on in the rare disease population. And we are able to go, as CDG are doing, to Congress and other people who are interested in rare diseases, but give them a snapshot of what's happening across different rare diseases. We'd like you to take our post-webinar survey, which you will be receiving in the next day or 2 in an email, so please do that. And then the premiere of today's recording will be shown in June, and Andrea will be in touch regarding that. And I know Andrea's planning some events around showing the recording so she can get a lot of people in different parts of the world to watch it when it's shown on our YouTube channel. And this is Andrea's information here. And hopefully you're already familiar with that. You can find it on CDG Care website. And this is my information. So with that, it's a great pleasure to work with the physicians and to see the leadership in CDG and NGLI1. I know that you've got a great future ahead of you because this is what it takes. It takes commitment from the patients, the parents, and the physicians, and the groups that are supporting the patients. So we would like now to bring this to a close, but if you stay on, if you are a patient and parent, you will be brought into the room where you'll be able to ask additional questions. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you very much. This brings our